to look at the covenants, particularly the Abrahamic covenant. Tonight we started looking at it a little bit last week. Tonight we're looking at some more details or some more parts to the Abrahamic covenant. Last week we particularly looked at the people involved and the purpose behind this covenant, and then tonight we're going to be looking at specifically some of the provisions that were within the Abrahamic covenant. There are 7 different installments. I get over a period of 40 years. The more that I went through this lesson, I find it highly unlikely we're going to make it through all 7 tonight. I ain't going to get through the first 4 if we make it that far. That's my goal anyway. I'll be highly surprised if we make it through all 7. We'll just see what happens, so to speak. But the Abrahamic covenant, as I said last week, this really is a vital covenant to understand. It's one of the most important ones within the entire Word of God, because so much is built off of it. It's not necessarily got a lot of detail to it. It's not like it has just a mind-boggling amount of stipulations and overtures to it. It's really fairly straightforward. It's pretty simple in its descriptions. We'll see that as we start looking at some of the provisions. But it's so important because when you start to misunderstand or misapply this covenant is when you start messing up pretty much the whole rest of the Bible. And many people have. We talked about that some last week. We talked about how the errors are trying to say that this is now for the church and things of that nature. It is simply, it is not. This is a covenant that God made with Abraham and with his descendants that would come after him. Both his literal physical seed and also the spiritual seed, who would follow his example and believe in Christ, be saved by faith, and who would then be grafted into the vine of Israel and become heirs of the same promises, even though they weren't on the same bloodline. And so the spiritual and the physical heirs as well. As you start looking at the provisions, you start looking at the first installment there in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, where it says, the Lord said to Abram, "Get thee out of your country and from your kindred, from your father's house, to a land that I will show thee, and I will make of thee a great nation, will bless thee and make thy name great, and you will be a blessing. I'll bless and bless thee, cursing that curses you, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed." This was the first installment that God gave to Abraham of this covenant that he was going to make. Obviously, if you look at those verses, there are quite a few details that are not given there, but that we tend to fill in because we know the rest of the story. But at this particular juncture, there are some things that Abraham simply doesn't know all of yet. He's just following what God tells him to do. And then as Abraham progresses in his life, and God reveals more and more and explains to him more and more of what's in store. This was revealed to him while he lived in Ur, in the land of the Chaldees. As Stephen mentioned that some when his sermon there before the council, before his martyrdom. Abram left Ur with Sarah, his wife, Terah, his father, and Lot, his nephew, and traveled northwest for about 600 miles to Haran, place named for his deceased brother. And then following Terah's death at Haran, Abraham, Sarah, and Lot made their way southwest to Canaan, which if you skip ahead to page 76. Yeah, page 76 has got a map that kind of outlines that a little bit. Essentially, it's a crude triangle, but basically he left Ur, went up to Haran, and then came back down to the land of Canaan. There, of course, there are many reasons why he did that. You don't travel through the desert. You and I definitely wouldn't, and even Abraham, for the experiences he might have been, he knew you don't travel through the desert. That's why Israel is so important, even throughout all of history, was because if you wanted to go to Babylon, you did a shortcut through the desert. No Pharaoh, no emperor was dumb enough to try that because it just didn't end well. You had to go up, and then you went over. And so that's what Abraham did. He went up, and he went over. He went up to Haran first, with his father with him in tow, and then eventually his father died. They left and they went down to Canaan. But they went and followed on down the rest of the way into the land of Canaan. As you start looking at this particular covenant, one of the things that God told him from the very beginning, there was a threefold commitment incurred by Abraham in accepting the covenant to which God had called him. He had to leave country, kindred, and home. We talked about this a little bit last week too, but it's hard for us to grasp how much of a sacrifice Abraham literally made when he left all of that behind. We live in, he says, a mobile society, worldwide communication readily and instantaneously available. It's hard to imagine how Abraham really left everything behind. He was committed to the Lord. He was going to leave everything behind and go on to a place that God was going to show him. You understand why the author of Hebrews said, very simply, he said that by faith Abraham is called to go out to a place that you would, after receive an inheritance, obey, without not knowing whither he went. Abraham had that much faith. From Abraham's perspective, when he left Ur, he knew full well that there was probably a pretty good chance that he would never be back again. He might never hear from people or again. Not knowing exactly how far he was traveling, but he didn't go any long distance. You didn't just hop on the back of a camel and drive for a year. The long journeys just didn't happen very often. So he knew that when he left everything behind, he was leaving things behind. Quite possibly, and very honestly, probably never be heard from and picked up again. We know at times he would send back to Haran, but as for Ur, we don't, there's no indication of that. But Abraham did by faith. He was willing to leave, and because of his commitment and his willingness to obey, God always promises us as his people good things, but oftentimes we are too ignorant and too blinded to be willing to accept it. When God says, I'll give you all the good things you want, we just never are willing to walk by faith. Abraham was willing. He accepted what God said. God promised Abraham certain things, and Abraham said, okay. And he got up and left. The deep commitment that was required of Abraham, a notable legacy was promised him. The sweeping promises involved land, posterity, blessings, honor, and the opportunity to be a blessing. The things that God promised him in the very beginning, of course, we know was the land. He said to get thee into a land that I will show thee. That's also kind of emphasized there in that verse in Hebrews where he says he went up not knowing whither he went. God did not identify or describe the land. All Abraham knew Chaldee was he's going someplace to which God would direct him. Think about that. I did Abraham to have enough faith to leave everything behind. He left it all behind to go somewhere. He didn't even know for sure where he was going. He just knew God said go. And so he got up and he went. A lot of times God's showing today, we'll know where God tells us to go, we still won't go. And Abraham didn't know where he was going. And he was still willing to get up and leave everything behind. Again, right as of this point in time, there is no landmarkers that are given. Abraham's not told he's going to Canaan, or he could be going across the world. We don't know. Abraham just obeying God. We're going to find out pretty quickly in the second installment that there is where his land is going to be. And so he left. Then, of course, his posterity. He was told, I'll make of you a great nation. There in Genesis 12 and 2. Again, how strange it had to sound. As you put it there, Abraham was around 75, had no children. His wife was as old as he was. But on human logic, that didn't seem like a very plausible idea. When God told Abraham, hey, you're going to have a large posterity. At 75, Abraham and his wife probably thinking, I don't know how that's going to happen, but okay. Because, if you think about it, even if they believe that they might be able to have a child, but, you think about 75, even if by chance they have a child, a huge posterity, that's even more unlikely. We have one kid, we'll be lucky, but to see a large amount of descendants, that doesn't seem plausible. Yet God promised it, and we'll find out that Abraham actually ended up having several kids, several sons and family before the end of his lifetime. And so God promised it to him. God's promises may not always seem like the most logical thing from a human perspective, but when God promises, God intends to fulfill it. That may not have made sense from a human point of view, but God was in charge of everything. God made man out of the dust of the ground. He can make an older couple to have children if he so desires them to. He can also make a virgin conceive and bear a child, as we know from Mary. Of course, he would be blessed. God said, I will bless thee, which means to speak well of. Abraham commended a favorable reputation far and wide, which that's really very interesting to think about it, because in the terms of, prophets, religious figures that we know of today, the three major religions in the world today are pretty much Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Think of that as the three major religions, and all three religions revere who? Abraham, given different means, but Abraham as a figure anyway is represented and revered in all of them. He truly is a favorable reputation among pretty much large portions of the population, even to this day. Now, of course, the Muslims get a lot of stuff wrong, and even the Jews aren't part of the spiritual seed anymore, by and large, but they still revere Abraham. What kind of a testimony is that? Yeah, how would we love to be blessed to the point where we were revered even thousands of years after we're long dead and gone by the huge chunk of the world's population? That's what Abraham did. God's always said, if you will follow me, I will use you. If you're willing to obey, I will bless you, and I'll take care of you. He said, I'll make your name great. And of course, his name would eventually be changed from Abram to Abraham. He's also the father. He received even more honor as God indicated when he changed his name. And not only would he be blessed, though, it also would be a blessing, because in addition to being a recipient of divine blessings, he was assured it would be the means by whom many people would be blessed. When God declared, you will be a blessing, and I will bless them that bless thee. Obviously speaking ultimately of Christ, but also of the blessings that other nations would receive. That promise is there when it talks about, I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curse you. Of course, that's been evidenced throughout the history of Israel. And Abraham would wind up in Egypt or someplace, and they'd be blessed because he was there. Joseph would bless the people he was with just because he was there, and he committed to following God, and he did things with. And also, of course, even still on a national level, when nations respect Israel and they try to do right by them, God blesses them, and God takes care of them. Nations that persecuted Jews and Christians have paid dearly, and such will continue to be the case. So the greater seed of Abraham becomes the earth's sovereign and rules of the nations for 1,000 years. One reason why the United States and other Western democracies have been so blessed is because of their support for the Jewish people. And indeed, that is the case. However sad it is that we no longer do that. By and large, our powers that be are simply trying to move away from the support of Israel. As I was reading earlier today, in a couple of days, I was looking at some of the Democratic platform, the things they hope to accomplish in the upcoming years, and part of their platform actually states that they want to achieve peace with Israel. Well, part of that, though, is they believe in the right of the Palestinians to have their land, and they want a twofold state. Well, I'm sorry, God didn't give the land to the Palestinians to give it to Israel. That's Israel's land, and for as much as they claim peace, they work against what God has said, and that's just not going to happen for many reasons, biblical otherwise. But nonetheless, this nation needs to remember that God blesses those who take care of his people. And there is punishment for those who turn their back upon them. And so, from the very beginning, Abraham may not have been told a lot of details about what he was going to receive, but he was told enough to get up and go. Even from the very beginning, God assured him many wonderful promises. We've got to be willing to obey, even when the path may not seem clear and logical from a human perspective. Always be willing to obey God. And it wasn't much sooner after that we come to this second installment of this covenant, which is still in chapter 12. But it says, Abraham passed through the land to the place of Sichem, or that is Shechem, and unto the plain of Moreh, and the Canaanite was in the land. The Lord appeared unto Abram and said, unto thy seed will I give this land, and there build an altar to to the Lord who appeared unto him. They traveled southward west for about 300 miles in Canaan, and their first place of sojourn was in Shechem. It was in central Canaan, as it is eventually be known as Sychar by the time of Christ's ministry. Now, Shechem was situated in an area favorable for farming and livestock. Now, when Abraham arrived, he found it was already occupied by Canaanites. That's important. And the Canaanite was then in the land. Okay, so this way of Abraham's land, but it was as of yet occupied by other national powers. So the patriarch pitched his tent near Shechem on the plain of Moreh. But by this time, Abraham was already a relatively wealthy man, as indicated by the fact that he and Lot left Haran and all their substance they had gathered on Haran and the souls that they had gotten there. And so Abraham left Haran, he traveled all this way. And the amount of time it took was probably quite a bit. He had a large caravan traveling 300 miles. That's going to take you a little bit. He gets to the land of Shechem. He pitches his tent. And what's the first thing that he does? Or one of the first things he does is he builds an altar. He builds an altar. That's right. A word out in a second. And he builds an altar to the Lord. I'll read more of that in a moment. But the promise of this land. In 12 and 7, God said, I'll give this land unto them. What had been a somewhat indefinite promise became more specific. Abraham had not yet learned the boundaries of the land which God had given him and his descendants, but he did know that the city of Shechem was his. You know, Abraham left not knowing what was his, and now he comes to the land of Canaan. He's sitting in Shechem. He's looking at the land that's currently occupied by Canaanites, and God says, this is your land. Still, he doesn't give the boundaries you and I know of today, but at least Abraham now knows, this is mine. This is mine. I may not get to dwell to occupy all of it with the Canaanites that are still here, but this is mine. Shechem became important. When they possessed the land, Joshua said Shechem would eventually be designated as one of the cities of refuge. And so Shechem becomes an important city and location throughout Israel's history for different reasons, but this is the first place where Abraham went to. You know, this is kind of the place that you can look back in Israel and say, you know, this city here, it may not be a large population, it may not be the most grand and glorious city, but it's important because this is the place where God first told Abraham that this was his land. And it became eventually a city of refuge, an important place where men could flee to find safety if they had committed involuntary murder. And of course, you come to that first altar there in Canaan. In response to this divine reiteration of promise of land to Abraham and his seed, the patriarch built an altar there in the region of Shechem. Second altar mentioned in Genesis. It is certainly noteworthy that Abraham was careful to acknowledge God so soon after his arrival in Canaan. The people in the land of that day were pagans that worshipped false gods. The example of some worshiping the true God was indeed an effective witness. You know, Abraham pretty much from the beginning established the fact that yes, this is mine, but here I'm going to build my own altars because I'm not going to find anything to God otherwise. I want to worship God. You know, Abraham was deemed it highly unlikely he was going to just walk around and say, "Oh, hey, look, you know, a temple dedicated to the worship of God." Probably what was going to happen. You eventually come to Melchizedek that was there that worshiped the true God, but this is a foreign land. 9 times out of 10, who you're going to meet are going to be some form of Canaanite and worship some form of Canaanite deity. You know, you may find a variety of idols, but they're not going to be the true God. You know, we forget at times how blessed we are to be able to go to pretty much any area in our state or in this country even, and pretty much be able to find a church somewhere. They have to travel a little ways, but they're generally pretty accessible. But Abraham wasn't that way. He knew if he's going to worship God, if he's going to have a place to worship God, he's going to have to build himself. And he did. He built an altar there at Shechem. You know, up until God authorized the building of the temple, and actually before that the tabernacle, and then eventually the temple, they didn't have a one place to worship God because they weren't stationary enough. Here, they've got an altar, and Abraham is worshiping the Lord. How difficult it might be, a child of God needs to worship God because of all that God has done for him. You and I have a spiritual need and a true physical need as well, to worship the Lord. He has been so good to you and me. There's so much we need to do in worshiping. Then we come to the third installment of this covenant. We've seen it go from land I will show you. Now we know it's in Shechem. Now as you come to the third installment, Abraham and his household have moved about 20 miles further south to the area of Bethel, where he erected another altar. Chapter 12, verse 8 says that he moved from thence to a mountain on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent out Bethel on the west, Ai on the east, and there he built an altar unto the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. But Abraham continued to migrate southward. He finally ended up in Egypt. You find that in the middle part there of chapter 12. And then following the patriarch's unfortunate moral failure in Egypt, this is the one where he lied. He told Sarah to say that the half-truth that he was just his sister. Well, half-truth is still a full lie. And in spite of all this, when he left Egypt, and he was saying all the livestock was there. They left Egypt. Where did they go back? They went back to Bethel, to the place of the altar. Abraham knew he had sinned. He knew he'd messed up, and so he went back first and foremost to the altar where he worshipped and where he had worshipped and prayed to God. There at Bethel. 13 and 4. He went on a journey from south even to Bethel. There he pitched his tent. Despite Abraham's sinful calling in Egypt, God allowed him to leave that place wealthier than when he arrived. Again, Abraham was blessed everywhere he went. He walked away even more blessed than he was in the first place. Lot had become a rich man as well. Because of all their possessions, it became difficult for Abraham and Lot to live together. So Abraham suggested they go their separate ways, 13, 8, and 9. Lot chose to move eastward to the Jordan River Valley, while they would have abundant pastures with many flocks and herds. However, as good as that appeared on the outset, we know that eventually that turned out to actually be the worst decision for Lot, because, well, it was just a little bit too good. And he wound up moving from the pastures, the city gates of Sodom and Gomorrah, and eventually began to become blinded and no longer convicted by the sin and immorality that was there. There's a great contrast between these two men. But Abraham dwelled in the land of Canaan, while Lot pitched his tent towards Sodom, 13 and verse 12. Another promise regarding the land. This installment of the Abraham covenant included another expansion of the promise regarding the land. And in chapter 13, verses 14 and 15, it says, the Lord said to Abram, after Lot was separated from him, lift up now thine eyes, look from the place where you are northward, southward, eastward, and westward. You are the land which you see, to thee will I give it, to thy seed forever. I'll make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so if a man can number the dust of the earth, then will thy seed also be numbered. Arise, walk through the land, and the length of it, and the breadth of it, for I will give it unto thee. Previously, the patriarch promised the land, and then this land in Shechem, and now on this occasion, he promised all the land which you see. Unlike Lot, whose decision to move towards Sodom was prompted by materialistic concerns, Abraham was content to remain where he was, even though the lush pasture land of the Jordan River might have been strongly enticing. Abraham left Canaan once when it seemed as if another place was more inviting, and it wasn't going to make a similar mistake so soon afterward. As to duration, the promise of the land was specified to be forever. Although the Jewish people had always occupied the land promised to them, the land is theirs nonetheless. And when Christ reigns over the earth, all of the land will be theirs. This becomes important, because now we see that important word of forever. I will give it to you and to your seed forever, without end. What God promised Abraham, it wasn't just going to be Shechem. For him, when he was a grandson, and maybe 3 or 4 generations after that or so, until eventually they wandered off after idols and fell into sin. It wasn't going to be that. No, God said, I'm going to give it to you and your descendants, and it will be y'all's forever. There's going to be no end to that. And as he said there in the book, Israel may have not always occupied it, And actually, they haven't never fully occupied all of it, but nonetheless, it's still there. God said, "This is your land," and eventually they're going to have all of it. And you start talking about, what land should Israel possess, what should be their land boundaries. Well, if you want to be technical, they're actually own a lot more land than they even try to occupy this day. Because they own all the way to the Euphrates River, which we'll get to that in the next installment, but it's there forever. Man cannot override or annul that. Other parties have lived in it. The Canaanites lived in it for a little while, even though God gave it to Abraham. And you can look at some of the other groups that have come in and lived there throughout the years, and even now you've got the Palestinians, all the other groups. But that's God's land that God gave to Israel, and it will be Israel's up until the time and when Christ rules, will be fully theirs. It will always be that way. And so the promise of the land is testified to be forever. Of course, you see more expansion also not only the land boundaries, but also in this installment you see another description of his descendants as being the dust of the earth. He's going to have a lot of descendants. He's one of the progenitor of a great nation whose people would maintain a sense of identity, even though they often would not be permitted to live in their own land. And how true that proved to be. Even Abraham probably had no idea the amount of dispersion that his people would face. Not only from the time in Egypt to all the times in the book of Judges that they were consistently being just overrun and then coming back. And through all these times of dispersion, they somehow remained and sustained their identity, and they remained God's people because they're God's. God preserved. Even though they may have known who they were and how far they'd scattered, God still remembered. And God preserved them. God kept them. And He will one day bring them back to their land. And the final installment we'll look at tonight there in Genesis 15. This is the fourth installment, and it's probably one of the more important installments that we come to because of some of the descriptions that are given here. It's actually probably the one that most of us think of. When we think of the Abrahamic covenant, most of the time we probably think of this chapter and the various details that are given here. It is probably the most, but nonetheless, it also contains three important features. You've got a threefold assurance given in 1 through 5, and acknowledgement of the patriarch's faith in verse 6. That's the verse that's quoted so often. When he says that he believed the Lord and was counted him for righteousness. And then also there's the divine ratification of that covenant that's given in verses 7 through 21. Beginning in chapter 15, these things, referring back to 14, Abraham will led a contingent of men, consisting of his own security force. Abraham rescued Lot and other captives from Sodom and Gomorrah from an alliance of eastern kings. However, Abraham refused to take any spoils of war, insisting that he did not want the king of Sodom to be able to claim that he had helped enrich Abraham. Abraham wanted to make sure everybody knew, hey, I'm wealthy and I may be well off, but it was because of God, not because of anything else that I have done. And so he's given here an assurance of protection. 15:1, Abraham was told, fear not, I am your shield and your exceeding great reward. God assured him he would be his shield and his protection, short of a provision. He said Abraham had any second thoughts about not taking the spoils of war for himself. God told him that he was an exceeding great reward. Of course, again, the assurance of posterity. Abraham is apparently becoming concerned. God not accepted the suggestion that Eliezer, the patriarch's trusted steward, could be the one. Abraham was assured that he would have an heir, a son, whom he would sire, produce a great multitude. God's always seeking to assure it. Every child of God, it doesn't matter how old you are, it doesn't matter what all you've done in your life, all of us at some point in time could do with a little bit of assurance. We all have doubts from time to time. Doubts aren't necessarily the problem. It's what you do with those doubts and how much you let those doubts run your life. That's where you get into problems. And Abraham was again assured. Abraham, don't worry about that. I'm your shield. I'll protect you. Abraham, don't worry. I will provide for you. I'll take care of you. And you will eventually have your son. You'll have that son that you need to secure the line and to carry on the promises. Yeah, Abraham may have taken a long time to see that for the birth of Isaac, but he never forgot that promise, because essentially that promise is what allowed him to take Isaac up there on Mount Moriah and offer him, because he knew, he said, God told me that through him my sins would come. Abraham may have had to wait a long time, even after getting the covenant, to see his son born. But even after his son was born, he never forgot that. He clung to that promise, and he knew it. He knew it well enough that he was willing to even kill his son, because, hey, I know what God told me about this son, and if I have to kill him, then God's going to raise him from the dead again. Abraham not only knew what the promises of God were, he trusted them, and he was willing to apply them to every facet of his life. God acknowledged Abraham's faith. We read that in 15:6. Abraham had believed God when he left earth, and he was continuing to live by faith. God knew his heart, and man observed his actions. That's Abraham was justified by faith the moment he believed and trusted in God back to earth. And now he's shown to be righteous time and time again as he progresses throughout, because he's always willing to obey and to follow the Lord. And then we come to, again, the ratification. There in 15, when God reiterated that Abraham would receive the land and promised him, on this occasion, however, the patriarch asked for confirmation. God told him, he said, I am the Lord that brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give thee this land inherited. They said, Lord God, whereby shall I know how to inherit it? He said to him, take you a heifer of 3 years old, a she-goat of 3 years old, a ram of 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Took unto him all of these, and divided them in the midst, and laid each piece one against another. But the birds divided not. When the fowls came down upon the carcasses, Abraham drove them away. And the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and lo, a horror of great darkness fell upon him. He said, and Abram, know of a surety, that your seed will be a stranger in a land that is not theirs. Will serve them, and they will afflict them for 400 years. And also that nation whom thou shalt serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out in great abundance. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace. You shall be buried at good old age. On the fourth generation there shall come hither again. The iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. It came to pass when the sun went down, and it was dark, below a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passed between these pieces. The same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, unto your seed have I given this land for the river of Egypt, unto the great river, the river Euphrates. So God again reaffirmed his covenant. He also expanded greatly the land that was promised to it, as well as giving him more assurance about this particular covenant that was here. Abraham was told to make all these varying sacrifices and to lay them out. Then when Abraham fell into a trance, during the ceremony, he observed a flaming torch, symbolic of the divine presence, that moved between the rows of these carcasses. A couple of things here. First of all, most importantly, in the ceremonies of those days, both parties would have done that, signifying joint responsibility. If I failed, it's my fault, and you can kill me just like we killed these animals. Abraham did not pass through those sacrifices, and therefore what is significant about that is that God is taking upon himself full accountability. God said, look, not only am I making this covenant with you, but I am taking upon myself full accountability, full responsibility to see it through. The Abrahamic covenant wasn't something that Abraham had to fulfill, and if he didn't, well, it was his fault. God told Abraham, he said, look, this is what I'm promising you, and if it doesn't come to pass, it's not on you, it's on me. I am taking full responsibility to ensure that this is done. The Abrahamic covenant is not only an everlasting covenant, one that doesn't end, because from the time that God says that this is for you and your sins forever, and it will be all fulfilled in the person of Christ, but it's also unconditional in the sense that God is not going to change it or cancel it. Anyway, on the process, it's going to come to pass. And there are provisions for their disobedience. We can get into that a little bit later. They don't obey this covenant. They're God's people, and he's going to ensure that they stay true. And of course, also not only is it reaffirmed there, but also you see the promise of the land that's reiterated. Again, Abraham's told, because this time he's told you're going to have 400 years of oppression there in Egypt. But then notice the land boundary that's given. He's told He's going to have the land from the river of Egypt all the way to the river Euphrates. And so that is a lot of land. Technically, if you want to be think about it, Abraham was told at one point in time to walk land that God promised him, and technically pretty much already had. Because Ur of the Chaldees is beside the Euphrates, and so by the time he went to Haran, he basically walked the Euphrates River and walked across. So in essence, Abraham's promised all the land he walked on, from the Euphrates River all the way to the sea, all the land of Canaan. And if you look at the map, the river of Egypt, it's a little brook, kind of separates the Sinai Peninsula from the land of Canaan, almost perfectly. And from all that land was going to be his. God said, "Go, I'm going to show you the land I'm going to give you." Where did you go? And Abraham said, "Okay, I'll go." He got to Canaan, and he was showing the land of Shechem, and God said, "This is your land." And Abraham said, "Okay." And Abraham believed God. And then a little later, he got a little more description of all the land he walked in there, the land of Canaan. And eventually he was assured, "You know what? Everything you've walked on, all that you've seen from the Euphrates River all the way over, see, all of this will be yours, to your descendants after you forever. And no one's going to take it from you. You won't always live here. You're going to have times where you're going to be oppressed and live in other nations. But eventually I'll always bring you back. You are my people. And I will bless you, and I will take care of you." And so again, these installments, every time God speaks to Abraham to get a little bit more of a reassurance and a few more details about all that is God has in store and planned for him. Which we'll pick up there next week with the 5th installment. But anybody have any questions?